Welcome back to the Spiderforest Webcomic podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, On Target. Many comic artists take a very focused approach to their work and aim specifically at a particular audience right from the start. This can be particularly true of work intended for younger audiences. One of the pitfalls of this approach, however, is that in an effort to make things youth-appropriate, an artist can cross that fine line between writing what young readers like and writing what they think young readers ought to like. How does an author tread this line and hopefully create something with broad appeal, but without dumbing things down in an attempt to please everyone? First, I have an interview with Christie and Deborah Lang, the co-creators of the graphic novel Quirk's Quest, and we'll talk about adventures, themes, and story structures in young adult comics. Then, our member Denise Randall of the comics Michael and the Only Half Saga will join me and Julian of the comic Littlelight Asylum for further discussion about writing comics for young audiences and all audiences. And this episode has been approved for all audiences, so stay with us. Hi, I'm Mathieu Moyen, and I create the comic Six Commando. I first met Christie and Deborah Lang in 2016, just before the publication of the first volume of their graphic novel Quirk's Quest. Though aimed at young adult audiences, it's gained a following as a comic of nearly universal appeal, incorporating themes, characters, and artwork that appeals to a broad audience, but without sacrificing the nuance and sophistication of a more complex work. We sat down recently to discuss their work and to talk about how Quirk's Quest has managed to successfully navigate this difficult territory.
My name is Christie, and I write and draw Quirk's Quest, which is a graphic novel series about a captain who goes out into the wild lands of an imaginary country called Cretonia. He's there to explore for the king. And it's more or less like a Lewis and Clark sort of situation, but the characters are sort of much funnier and furrier and less competent, say, than Lewis and Clark. So it's kind of like Lewis and Clark meets the Muppets, and they get into all sorts of trouble and out of all sorts of trouble. It's a high-action adventure kind of situation.
Hello, I'm Deborah Lang, and I also write and draw. The way that we do our collaboration, we've been doing this for a very long time. We started this in junior high instead of paying attention to class. And for a long time, we've been each other's audience. So we would write and draw a pass and then give it to the other person, and then they would read it, and then they would write and draw a pass and give it back. So it's sort of a weird style for comic writing, but that's how we started and that's how we continue. And so the stories that are in press now are actually stories that we've already wrote a little while ago, but we're now presently redrawing them. And, time helps you edit correctly. So we've been moving things around. And in the books that are out for sale, the final art is done by Rob. And, we both do layouts and writing, but he does the final inks and the final colors.
Mostly for consistency's sake.
It's interesting for me to hear that you guys have been collaborating for so long. Is Quirk's Quest a story that you started working on earlier, or is it something newer that's sort of tapping into that same kind of vein?
So we started with the world of Cretonia, where we had characters and animals and plants, and we started as kids usually do with kings and queens and big adventures. Then we started with other stories involving more regular, everyday, ordinary characters. But this book that we have now, we started around 2006, and it's a more recent story for us. So this story has to do more. It still has to do a little bit with the king, but not very much. But it still is involved in the same world as the rest of our stories.
Do you feel like having started these kinds of stories earlier makes them more potent? Hearing that you guys have been collaborating for so long and seeing that you have a style and a sort of a story construct that strikes me as having these very simple and straightforward conflicts to them, but that are also at the same time, they're a step more sophisticated. They're several steps more sophisticated than picture books. It seems to me to be aimed at sort of the 10 to 14 crowd. Do you feel that having had that early interaction and being able to focus on those sorts of stories that have that sort of straightforward conflict to them makes something like Quirk's Quest more potent?
I don't know. What I would say is, we didn't write it for an audience. We wrote it for each other. I mean, because when we first met, we were around the age, that age group that you're saying that it seems like it's written for. So we either haven't developed very much since then, or we know, or our younger selves are right on target and writing the stories. It's interesting because we didn't really write it for an audience, but I think it speaks to that audience because I guess it's where its origins are. It's like we were together just writing stories for each other, and now we developed this world together ever since. The straightforward conflicts that you're talking about are there, but it's the simplest way for us, I think, to explore the world that we've created together, if that makes sense.
Yeah. We were writing for each other, and we're not thinking, oh, let's write a story for 10-year-olds. Sometimes I think some books that are written, oh, let's write them for 10-year-olds, they think that they have to have a more simpler story, or that, they have to sort of like dumb it down for kids. And I think that kids naturally don't like things dumbed down for them. So we don't simplify our language in the story. We've had a couple of comments about we use script, and people are like, oh, kids don't know how to read scripts. The kids at the cons and the kids that we know that read the book have really seemed to have no problem with it. So kids are really smart. They could figure things out. And I'm hopeful, and I believe that they appreciate that in our books.
Children don't like to be talked down to, and that when I was a kid, I didn't like to be talked down to. Like when I was at the so-called target demographic of young adult fiction, I was reading things like Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and things that were sort of more sophisticated than someone at my age was, quote unquote, supposed to like. It is sort of a delicate balance to write something that is going to be that's going to have conflicts that will be engaging to kids, but without talking down to them, to write things that have a kind of broad appeal to them without seeming insipid, which is, I guess, another danger on the other end to it, is that if you're trying to please everybody, you won't please anybody. But on the other hand, if you aren't at least somewhat targeted in the kind of story that you're writing, then you're going to lack focus.
So when we first started writing this, we were kids, but we continued well past the kid age. And when we first started interacting with our publisher, they're like, oh, we think we want to aim this at this, 10 to 14, or, I think they also mentioned 7 to 12. And at first I was like, whoa, wait a second. I don't write this for such little kids. But actually, when at the conventions, the kids that are that age group are the ones that they go to our table and they sit there and then they just, stand there looking through the book, and they really seem to enjoy it. And I think it has a lot of aesthetics that the kids appreciate, because I think we lose that after a while because we're busy, where we could really look at a picture and admire the details and spend a little bit of time. But I think that, and they were able to follow the story fine. And I think kids are very sophisticated. But I see now that the publisher was right, that this is a good age group, and that there's actually a need for graphic novels for this age group, because there is the picture books, and then you have Saga and all these other things which is really not age appropriate. So then you have this middle age where they may be mature enough to understand very sophisticated storylines and, dialogue, but there's concepts of, like sex and, very overt violence that they may not be wanting that or ready for it. I'm pretty happy with the niche that we're in right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because the kids are more sophisticated or open to sophisticated ideas. Well, that'll be tested in the second book even more so. But I think a lot of parents are like, oh, they kind of want morality stories. They want a nice, clean idea of oh, this is good, this is bad. And I guess our older selves, even though the conflicts are relatively straightforward, we try to write our characters that there isn't a clear set, not necessarily good, bad, but it's everyone has their flaws. And we try to write even our, Haka, our main villain in the first book. We have compassion for her. And as you go on, you learn that maybe she's almost as much a victim as anyone else, in the story. Even though the conflicts are very kind of simple, we want the characters to have a depth, that makes ultimately the conflicts are a little more elaborate than just, oh, we're trapped and now we have to escape, and that sort of basic storytelling.
And we follow a premise too that every character is a hero in their own story. I think you probably have heard that, and we really believe that too. Nobody's wakes up and I'm going to be a villain today. Everyone believes that they're doing the right thing. And so we try to write our characters like that. Also, we believe that the world is also a character, and because it's a Lewis and Clark-like story, the nature is part of the story. And sometimes nature is cruel, like creatures eat other creatures. And we find sometimes the parents are like, oh, things are being killed and eaten. That's upsetting to us. But the kids seem to be fine with it because it's just part of life. And if you have a story involving nature, you have to have, the prettiness and the ugliness together.
Do you see it as a sort of a paradox, though? Because it seems to me that kids of a certain age, when they're on the cusp of young adulthood, are craving greater sophistication in the world generally. People seek it out. It's why I think it's one of the reasons why books like the Harry Potter series and like more sophisticated science fiction like Nancy Farmer and even, like I said, Asimov or Heinlein get very popular around that age. At the same time, it seems to me that we're also at a point now in the sort of the literary development, particularly with comics, but just in literature generally, where adults are beginning to crave more simplicity.
Again, I don't think you could almost think of it as like there's a part of like the children in us that writes the story, and then the adults come in and kind of edit it and say, okay, is this working? Is that working? Should we emphasize this emotional context or should we make this a little more sophisticated in terms of what were we trying to say when we wrote this and what can we say about it now? Because again, we write it separately. Like I'll write 10 pages and hand it to Deb and she'll write 10 pages. So it's a really, I wouldn't say unfocused, but
it's an organic process.
It's an organic process. So we get I'd say like the adult part of us gets to go back and say, okay, what's here is working and what here is speaking has an emotional resonance for adults. So I think it works because of our writing style. And again, it's very unusual. I think we can kind of play both sides of that field. And I think that shows up when we go to the cons and show it to people and get feedback, because we get a lot of young children, like anywhere from say 8 to about 10, that come in and they're just mesmerized. And then I think there's like a big age gap. I think your 14 to 20-year-olds are just like, they have they like look right through it. And then, around 35, the people are coming over and going, what's this? I've never seen anything like this before. We see that at the cons, that there's definitely, even just visually, it's speaking to two very separate age groups.
I would hesitate to use the word nostalgia there, but do you think that plays something into it?
Oh, yeah, we do get a lot of people come up to us and mention that our stuff looks like Fraggle Rock. We get that a lot. Being compared to Jim Henson is never insulting. It's actually, that's very complimentary. I think maybe indirectly we had some influence. I think it's more of a superficial comparison, but I think some people are drawn to it because they remember Jim Henson's wonderful art. But for the kids come over to it because I think it's the colors and the pictures that draw them in.
To go back to the point about sort of the age gap that you deal with, why do you think that is? I mean, I've noticed that as well, and I've noticed it a lot actually in my own taste. I'm pushing 40 at this point. Why do you think that is? I mean, there's the things that you like when you're young become things that you sort of disdain in your sort of, I don't want to call it your middle years, but sort of your young adulthood. And then they come back to you again, I've noticed it with things that I've seen, in particular like the work of Hergé for the Tintin books, which I read when I was very young, and I thought they were terrific. And in the middle years, I thought, well, okay, so it was this sort of unsophisticated thing that now is so much more that's way better than that. And now I'm coming back and sort of appreciating it on a different level now. And I think you see that a lot with modern animation, too, where adults and parents in particular are able to enjoy kids' shows with their kids on a different level. To go to the point about Jim Henson, actually, don't you think that was something about Jim Henson's work that broadened its appeal in that way? I mean, that strikes me as complimentary on more than one level.
Absolutely. I mean, Jim Henson was an adult having a wonderful time creating a world for children, but he came at it with a sophistication. I mean, you look at all the little dumb sketches from Sesame Street they were teaching you about near and far, but there's an enormous amount of really clever storytelling in just a small skit that he put together for that. And then, I mean, I may be talk about nostalgia and a total sap, but the Muppet movie is still one of my very favorite movies. And it's more than just a nostalgic thing for me, but if you look at the message of that movie, it's all about an artist trying to live out their dream, which is an enormously sophisticated thing to look at as an adult. It's like, how do you make that journey? But yet it's still so entertaining for the children.
Yeah, and I think people respond differently at different ages to society pressures. I think when you're younger, you're just trying to figure out what the world is, and everything is relatively new to you. So it makes you very open to new ideas, and you're just like taking everything in. But then society says you have to you want to conform. Everyone wants to be accepted by society. So there's things that you will reject because you're like, oh, that's for babies, or that's for this type of person, but I'm like, want to be accepted. And teenagers have to deal with a lot, unfortunately, with this whole idea. And young adults too, when they go, to college, everyone wants to fit in, and it's a terrible pressure. And then you get older and you're like, why am I doing this to myself? I've worked, I just need to live my life. And then, you're able to pay your rent, and you're like, I'm independent, and it's freeing. And I think then you go back to that freedom of not letting society totally suffocate you again. And I think it allows you to be open to new things, and also to remember a time before all this stress is when you could, just enjoy things for what they are. And I think that this nostalgia may fall into that.
Right. You go back, at least for myself, it's like I have so many of the books that I had as a child. For whatever reason, I was smart enough to keep them.
Yeah.
And when I got into I probably didn't look at them at all between the ages of 15 and 25. But then at some point I was like, oh, remember this book? Oh, this was, I love this. And then at that point, hopefully you're able to look at it all and say, what was it that I loved about this? And then you can really look at it through a different set of eyes. It doesn't, as Deb says, doesn't need to conform. It can just like things for its own merits, regardless of what your peers are telling you should like or what the fashion of the day is.
Probably one of the things that is most reassuring about what you've been saying about your work is that what you're doing now happens to coincide with a particular trend among readership at this particular moment. You're sort of in the right place at the right time, right? Like you're at the cusp of sort of the new print revolution, whereby people who do smaller books are able to take a place with people who do larger run things. I mean, First Second, for example, is not a small publisher these days by most people's estimate. To have your book published through them is quite an achievement just in itself. But at the same time, to be able to say that this is something that I would be doing it this way regardless is kind of an achievement as well.
Yeah, we were doing this for the art itself, for our enjoyment, irregardless of whether we would be able to publish it. But you're right, we have a fortunate timing where the public in general is much more receptive to this alternative style of art. I think that First Second is a great example. First Second is very supportive of non-superhero type storytelling in graphic form. They've been around for more than 10 years, but if you look at what they put out 10 years ago, the number of books they put out for the whole year is less than they put out per season now, which is great. But there's more of a demand for it, and they're not alone. There's other publishers out there that are offering this, independent alternative storytelling. So we're fortunate in that regard to have our publishing, be timed with this golden age, I think, in graphic novels.
Yeah, and again, to go back to First Second, I know that Mark Siegel and First Second, like one of their main drives is to get graphic novels into libraries and specifically into young readership programs. The amount of stuff they're putting out for the young audience, including their science comics that are so fantastic, and now they've just started Maker comics, and just their absolute commitment to get these into the libraries and school libraries and young readership, and have them be not only like our stuff is, action, adventure, fun, good old, almost fairy tale kind of situation, but they're really driving for the educational market too. And the librarians, half the time we go to these art shows and we're just getting librarians coming up and saying, we love your book. The kids love your book. We're constantly doing readings of your book. in the libraries. And it's so fantastic that the librarians are behind us. And I think that goes back to what we were saying. It's like, for those of us who grew up on, Hergé and Tintin and, say, Asterix, I was a big fan of Asterix back when. Deb and I were both ElfQuest fans way, way back when. Now our age group are the librarians, and we were like, we loved these books when we were kids. Graphic novels are a completely valid literary thing. Sure, we'll carry them in our libraries.
Yeah. Librarians are awesome. Librarians are wonderful people, and they've been great for us. And we're fortunate to be with a publisher who's also very interactive with libraries, because some, not everyone could go out and get yourself a whole stack of graphic novels, but most kids have access to a library book. And a lot of the kids that I've spoken to who've read our book, they've read them in a library, and that's really wonderful.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Denise Darwin Randall. I am the creator of Michael and also the creator of The Only Half Saga. I'm here with Mathieu Moyen.
Hi, I'm Matt Moyen, and I create the comic Six Commando, and I also conducted the interview for this episode.
And I'm also here with TD Julian, or Julian, of Littlelight Asylum.
Hi.
I listened to the interview that we had, and it was all about creating a comic for younger audiences. So my first question for the both of you is, do you have a specific target audience for your comic? Because I know Littlelight Asylum is aimed at younger audiences. And Mathieu, I know you said you had input on what it is to be a children's author or a children's comic creator. So we'll start with you, Julian.
When I started writing Littlelight Asylum, I didn't exactly have a target audience in mind. I was just thinking about Halloween specials I used to watch as a kid. That got me the idea of monster kids and the supernatural misadventures they would get into. And then I was just writing it as something I would have wanted to see still now today, not just as a kid, the kind of adventures that they get into. So I didn't particularly have a target audience, so I'm not writing for kids. That's why I say it's all ages. It would relate to anybody. It's safe and it has themes that are okay for kids, but then people of older audiences can still enjoy it.
That's interesting. So what were your influences for Littlelight Asylum? What did you grow up watching?
Things that were like Halloween. As a kid, I loved Tim Burton movies. So things that fit that aesthetic always caught my attention. But I watched things like Ed and Eddie, Cow and Chicken, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Pretty much if it was animated and it was on TV, I watched it every single day.
I grew up in a completely different era, so those were all things that were available when I was an adult. So I was already kind of past that point. But I know exactly what you're talking about all of those. Those were really cute cartoons. So Mathieu, the same question. I know that your current comic it's not really for younger audiences, but you said you had input on this, so I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, I don't think that it's so much that it's aimed or not aimed at younger audiences, but I think it draws a lot more on influences from when I was younger, definitely. And one of the things that I took from the interview when I was conducting that with our guests was that kids are a lot smarter than people generally give them credit for. And you don't necessarily need to write directly for kids because you may end up sort of talking down to them. So, I mean, in terms of my influence, I'm pushing 40 and I grew up in the sort of the late 70s, early 80s. So Six Commando is a story that draws a lot on the sort of feelings and anxieties that I had when I was younger, because it was the end of the Cold War. It was also a very dangerous time in the world. And I think it was a time when adults weren't aware of how aware kids were of what was going on in the world at that time. And that's why I think I was able to sort of draw on that as source material, even though it has a sort of a late Cold War communism versus the West kind of setting to it. It's not so much about that as it is just sort of about awareness of there being enemies and there being sort of an other person out there, and coming to an awareness over time of the fact that the divisions in the world are sort of artificial, and that when you face down somebody who you think is completely antithetical to everything that you are, you very often realize that they're closer to you than you might think. And that, I think, is probably the major theme of it. And really, that theme for Six Commando comes out of being young at a particular time in history.
What are some of the challenges, do you think, of writing for a younger audience? Because, Matt, you and I were in our 40s, And that time period was a long time ago for us. And even Julian, as an adult, what are some of the challenges that you guys have faced when writing for these younger audiences?
I think it would be just making sure it's okay. I think kids' stories can touch on a lot of mature subjects, and they do, that can still be accessible to kids. It's just how you go about it. You want to make sure it's still safe for them. You don't want to go too far. So that's always in the back of my mind when I'm writing stories. I always want the main focus of Littlelight is to be fun and to bring the reader an experience that will hopefully brighten their day. So most of the stories do focus on lighter subjects, but I do plan to do more mature themes later. And I'm always looking towards like inspirations I had as a kid that tackled more mature subjects, but could do it in a way that it wasn't too heavy for kids. So that's the only thing that I can think of that would be a challenge.
I have done some preliminaries for a couple of stories that would be aimed at more of a young adult audience. And I think that probably the big challenge is in attempting to engage with young adults really on a level that they can understand. And that's not by way of saying that young adults can't understand sophisticated themes. I think that more often than not, the concern would be the opposite, which is that you'll oversimplify things to the point that a younger person would feel talked down to. I think that a big part of it may be trying to talk to people in a way that makes them feel as though you understand what it was like to be their age and what it was like to see the world from their perspective.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. And that is one of the concerns that I have even with Michael. Again, I'm 48, so I think the only thing that's saving me right now is that I work with 10 to 12-year-olds in my classroom, and so I'm seeing how their social interactions are occurring. But I still fear that I'm going to either oversimplify it or expect them to understand concepts that I'm maybe shooting too high on. So that kind of leads me into the next question. How do you balance that? How do you touch on these sophisticated things? Like in my storyline, I'm going to be dealing with like anger management issues, and my character is a teenager, so he has to deal with the whole gender thing and the opposite sex. And there's actually going to be a point in the story eventually where there's like a teen pregnancy scare. So, I mean, how do you touch on that without being too sophisticated, but not talking down to the audience at the same time?
I don't think you can aim too high with kids, really. And I say that just from experience. I don't think it was possible to aim too high with me when I was a certain age. When I was between, say, the ages of 10 and 16, I was reading things like Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. At that age, I was also reading sort of the more formulaic books of the time, things like John Bellairs, and I had a whole lineup of different young adult authors who I was interested in at the time. Oh, Nancy Farmer, definitely. Nancy Farmer, probably one of the great science fiction writers of the modern times. The point I suppose I'm making is that if you aim to talk to somebody from the perspective of being an adult, talking to a child or talking to somebody who's younger, I think that is sort of going to end up missing your mark. I think that you should talk straight, but in a way that's consistent, And I tend to think, when I think about young adult fiction, and when I think about the kind of work that I really enjoyed when I was that age, and the way that I liked being talked to when I was that age, I think that that's going to keep you more on target.
I think kids' stories or all ages stories can touch on any or most mature subjects. It's just you have to be a little subtle with it. You can't exactly, for some of the things, you can't exactly say what you're talking about. You might have to use a metaphor or allude to something to where you're not talking down to the kids. The kids that in the story that you might be writing for, you have to write how they would experience it and how they would deal with it. Because all ages stories have tackled subjects from death to depression. It's just how you approach it. You can't exactly, if you were making a story where drugs are involved or even gun violence, like an example I can think of is the show on Cartoon Network, OKKO. They did an episode about gun violence, but they didn't actually use guns. It was a little remote that a salesman was selling to the town that he made them believe they needed that would turn them into skeletons. And the message at the end of the story is that you don't need all these remotes to feel safe. So you have to think about how you're going to bring the message to a younger audience without, I wouldn't even think about not talking down to them. I'm just think about as the characters, how would they go through this? How would they experience it?
That's a really good point, I think. That brings into it sort of the more of the how you conceptualize the story and really write the character from the inside, as opposed to conceptualizing the message as though you're talking writer to reader. I think that's an excellent point.
The next thing that I wanted to talk about, Disney is really good about making cartoons, making these animated features that work on many different levels. I mean, when I watched it when I was little, even like The Rescuers, when it first came out, it had certain things that appealed to kids. But then I go back and I watch it as an adult, and I'm seeing completely different layers and levels that I didn't notice as a kid, and it worked as an adult as well. And I think you guys addressed that in the interview as well, Matt, where you talked about how things work on different levels. So can you successfully make a webcomic or a comic appeal to different levels of audience? So, can you make it appeal to, like Julian, you said, all ages? Can you make it appeal to a 10-year-old and a 45-year-old and still get the same kinds of satisfaction out of the storylines?
So what I think is the best way to relate to both kids and an older audience is to just be genuine and sincere about what you're saying, and not think of it as a kid-friendly story, but just a story you want to tell. When I was a kid, I had a grandma, and she was 60 at the time, but she loved cartoons, and she's the reason why I loved cartoons. And we had so much fun together watching Disney movies. Her favorite was The Lion King, and she loved old cartoons like Tom and Jerry and Looney Tunes and all the other ones.
The Roadrunner.
Yes. But she was 60 years old, and The Lion King is something that was made during my time, but she still could relate to it, and she still loved it, and she still enjoyed it. That was one of her favorite movies. She was the one who wanted to watch that when I came over, not me. I still wanted to watch it, but she was the one who would insist to watch it. So I think it just being genuine and sincere in that this is a story, these characters and the conflict that they're going through, and not just think of it as just another story and not making a kid's story. Most stories all ages stories can just appeal to all age groups. I've noticed that I have a lot of readers between ages 18 and 25, and then some that are 30 and up. And there's a lot of adults today that I see online that still watch cartoons, the new cartoons that are coming out, and are big fans of them, like Steven Universe or shows like that. And I'm one of them. I'm in the kids section of comic book stores when I go to look for new stories. So the stories I read, you can tell by reading them as an adult that they're not talking to little kids. They're just talking. They're just telling their story of these characters that are in the book. So I think that's the only thing you should really think about.
I know that I'm still one of those people who watches movies, cartoons, and that sort of thing with my daughter as well. I haven't really kept up with the most recent on Cartoon Network and whatever, but I do still like every time a Disney movie comes out or a DreamWorks movie comes out, I do like watching those animated features. I still enjoy them. I love seeing great animation and great art in those, and I think that would hold true as well in a comic book setting, that if you, like you said, being genuine to your own art style and to your own story that you're trying to tell, and then the audience follows. So I have to agree with everything that's been said so far. So that's really all the questions that I've come to the table with. Do you guys have anything else that you'd like to discuss regarding this subject, or are we kind of in a good place right now?
Something that interests me about young adult fiction, there's always a temptation, I think, to rely on formulas. When you're writing fiction of any kind that you intend to be sort of series fiction, I think there's a tendency, though, to see formulas as sort of a generically bad thing. Formulaic is a word that carries negative connotations, but I mentioned John Bellairs earlier. There's the whole Harry Potter series. There's any number of other book series that have used formulas that, some work and some don't. But so there's really nothing wrong with it being with trying to find a formula that works. There's something about that interests me, though. I can't really put my finger on it, but it does seem to be more prevalent in young adult fiction. And I think it's probably sort of becoming common in comics right now. Really, one of the things is sort of visual similarities that you see in a lot of comics. I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that people are coming from sort of high-end animation backgrounds from, say, the late 90s, early 2000s, who are now getting into comics and webcomics in a very major way, that is sort of drawing these things into sort of a more visually similar kind of theme. Do you see that? I mean, maybe this is a broader question than is just targeted at kids, but the style of it to me seems very kid-friendly in a sort of an turn-of-the-century animated features for all kind of way. Has anyone else noticed that, or is that just me? Maybe that's just me.
No, it's not just you. A lot of the comics that I've seen come out recently are very similar in art style, very cartoony, seem to be kind of posed to draw in a broader audience. It's almost as if we're getting to a point where there's a lot of what look like carbon copies. You know, like Steven's Universe was mentioned, and a lot of them look in that Steven's Universe style. I think that it's popular now, and I don't know whether it's the creators are trying to cash in on that popularity or whether that's just the style that they grew up looking at and they're just applying it because, you know, we all know that that's the sincerest form of flattery is, you know, emulating those same sorts of styles.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing, you know, so long as it's done correctly. Mm-hmm. It's just like what constitutes correct is something I'm certainly not qualified to say.
No, I don't think any of us are.
Yeah, I do notice there is similarities between a lot of comics, like the cartoons like Steven Universe and cartoons that have similar art style to that. It's not a bad thing. It is something that is noticeable. I'm not really sure on like why that is, but I do know that it doesn't really hurt or detract from what the story may be about. I think it's the characters that really draw people into these. The art style is always, even if it's a varied art style, the art styles for all ages stories are usually bright or colorful because for the most part, most all ages stories focus on fun. So, and those are the kinds of things that immediately, no matter what age group you are, you recognize that as fun when you see these bright colors and these happy characters. So there is a bit of a similarity, but I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just, so long as the characters are there, I think in all ages stories, that's the biggest thing. Not so much the world. I mean, all aspects of storytelling is important, but characters are what really draw people in to these kid-friendly stories.
Well, it makes me wonder whether it's sort of become its own set of icons appropriate to that particular thread of comics at the moment.
Yeah.
Like when I started working on Six Commando, I very consciously directed it towards a kind of color scheme and sort of a very hard line kind of a style because it tapped into this 1980s kind of animated world. I was thinking of things like, I mean, I don't even know, like G.I. Joe is the only one that immediately comes to mind, but it's sort of a subversion of G.I. Joe in the sense that they're all dealing with these really pretty heavy-duty catastrophes that they have to solve, but doing it in the visual style of something at the time. It's sort of drifted away from that as I've developed, but that was sort of my intent originally. I wonder if that's sort of become, now that we're on the cusp of sort of this new generation of rising artists, that has like, it's becoming a sort of a visual shorthand for like, this is an adventure comic that is of this generation, that is producing an adventure that is targeted towards the kids who can enjoy it on that level, targeted towards the adults who once enjoyed it on that level when they were kids.
You know, now that you mentioned that, I come to think of what I was watching when I was younger, you know, Thundercats and G.I. Joe and several of those other American cartoons that were out there. And I realized now that I have a very, I won't say terribly realistic style, but I have a more realistic style than quite a few other people who produce comics. And I think you're right. I think that is an influence, like what we grow up seeing actually influences our own style. I mean, even though mine is, everybody's told me that my style is completely different from anything they've ever seen, I still think it's influenced by what I grew up with, now that you mention that. And I would have to say that, yeah, if with these new ones, it probably is the touchstone for them to create their works.
It would be interesting to think. I think about the like what are the limits of that? I wonder. I don't. I mean, I'm not asking a question really. I'm just sort of saying, visual shorthand has to develop at some point into something unique, or you end up with a lot of stories that are just sort of the same thing over and over again. If you think structurally about the Harry Potter books, for example, because that's something that almost everybody who knows anything about current literature knows something about it. Even if you haven't read it, you know pretty much what the basics of it are. Like every one of those books follows a very specific structure, and you know in the structure what's going to happen at what part of the book. And it always happens. It never disappoints. Now, the variation on the theme is what keeps the books interesting as they go through. I'm not a huge fan of Harry Potter, but I recognize its importance, and I have listened to audiobook versions of it. And that was something that I was thinking about very specifically as I was reading. I was like, okay, the next part is going to be this kind of story. And then the part after that is going to have this plot complication. And then the part after that is going to be where the resolution happens. And then the part after that is going to be the denouement. There's a very specific sort of a formula to it that happens in the storytelling. It would be interesting to know whether that is something that's happening visually at this particular point in time as well. Like somebody who's developing a comic now or shortly before now, or like sort of in this particular point in time, choosing styles or choosing stylistic elements or choosing influences to run from that point to that particular kind of structural form in a comic that's aimed at certain people or certain target audiences.
I think I see what you're saying. I think the young audiences that grew up watching the cartoons and movies that they love or drawing the stories, these comics, and have similar art styles, I think that was unintentional. I think they had their inspirations, but usually, at least for me, I don't think about what I want this to be like, this cartoon and this cartoon. I just think about the story, and then I just write whatever I see in my head. And I think they follow a similar way of thinking, and subconsciously maybe they are adding in the features and the art styles they grew up with in a kind of a mix. So that's where these similarities can be seen. There are differences in each art style, but they're a little similar to where you can say, oh, these are kind of starting to follow a bit of a trend.
I think trend would probably be the better word for it. Definitely. In the end, like every fish breathes the water they're swimming in. You know what I mean? So no one escapes from their influences and does something genuinely new, because where do you start from that? So it would be interesting to me to see what the next generation does with what we're producing now. I mean, not to get my head too big, because I doubt that anyone is going to draw a huge ton of influence from what I'm doing. What I do is very much in a very small niche in the webcomics world. But just sort of like what we as like webcomic artists are producing right now, it's got to influence somebody. It would be interesting to see what the next, like what trend are we starting? You never really know what trend you're starting. So it would be interesting to see that. And it would be particularly interesting to know later down the road what young people might be reading of our work now that might influence them when they get older, if they go into an artistic career.
Yeah, I would like to see what it's going to look like in a decade myself, because I don't think it's going to look the same as it does now. I don't think what's now looks the same as it did 10 years ago. So I do agree that what we're doing now is an influence. We've been influenced. We should influence others. So it's going to be interesting. I agree.
Yeah, that'd be really cool to see.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer for this program is Christina Major, and Eva is our director, our showrunner, and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support. To learn more about the collective, our members, and our projects, or to make a donation, go to spiderforest.com. You can also find us on Kickstarter. This week is the final week of our Kickstarter campaign for Volume 2 of Threads, the Spiderforest comic anthology. Check it out and take an opportunity to support us while there's still time, and you'll also get a copy of some of our members' best work. This is a really good one, so please check it out. To find out more, go to spiderforest.com or to Kickstarter. We'll add a link in the description for this episode. I'd like to thank Robert Christie and Deborah Lang for joining us for this episode. The first volume of their graphic novel, Quirk's Quest, is published by First Second. I'd also also like to thank Denise Randall for bringing us this episode's discussion, as well as Julian for joining me in participating in the panel. Darwin creates the comic Michael and The Only Half Saga. You can find them both at darwincomics.spiderforest.com. Julian produces the comic Littlelight Asylum. You can find it on Webtoon and at littlelightsylum.spiderforest.com. Eva produces the comic Bits Fair. You can find it at bitsfair.com, and I produce the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.